One of the things that is true about the people of Teesdale is their honesty and their integrity. The people of Teesdale have a strong sense of what is right, what is wrong, and a strong sense of how you should treat other people and the guiding values that you should follow when you are doing business with people or when you are speaking to people. And that set of principles and values is definitely something that the guest for today's podcast has taken with him throughout his life. My name is Simon Henderson. I am Head of History and Sixth Form at Teesdale School, and this is episode 3 of Made in Teesdale.
Made in Teesdale.
And we actually sat there one night watching John Wayne's stage Ghost-film projected onto the wall while looking down at the scene below.
It is absolutely fascinating seeing inner city London children dropped into the middle of a working farm.
I have very fond memories of growing up in Teesdale. I mean, living in the countryside and having, loads of fresh air, loads of space to play.
It really is the case that if you come from County Durham, and in my case have lived in southwest London for 40 years, but County Durham is still what I call home.
Made in Teesdale.
My guest for today's episode of Made in Teesdale is Nigel Hugill, who started at Teesdale School in 1973 and has gone on to be an incredibly successful businessman. He leads the Urban and Civic Property and Development Company, which has built schools and housing developments and other properties all across the UK. I am delighted that he has found some time to speak to us today. Hi Nigel, how are you?
I'm very well, very nice to talk to you.
And you too. I wonder if you could start by sketching for us your early life in Teesdale and when you were there and when you were in school and when you left and all things in the past.
Well, I started at Teesdale in 1973. I was only in the sixth form and I left to go to Oxford University. I think I was the first person to go to Oxford from the school, which at that time was just moving from being a grammar school to a comprehensive. The school had actually been set up in 1959. So when I got there, it'd been going for 14 years. And I benefited from a wonderful partnership, which some people might remember, the Bagleys. So Mr. Ben Bagley, and his wife, Margaret. Margaret was the deputy headmistress at Teesdale, and Ben Bagley had been the original headmaster at what was then Barnard Castle Grammar and Technical School, and he went on to be the headmaster at Durham Johnson. And before I came to Teesdale, I had been at Durham Johnson. So I benefited from this, as I say, wonderful partnership of that were educational powerhouses at that time in the North East, and who contributed so much, not just to me, but also to education in Durham County generally.
So what was it that you were studying in the sixth form? What were your passions academically?
Well, I'm not sure I was as passionate as I ought to be, but I did English and history and maths, and then I applied to, the school wasn't tremendously well set up then for applications to Oxford, because you used to have to do special entrance exams. So I did those and something called Modern Studies, and I owe everything really to, again, a teacher now, sadly now died, called John Holloman, my head of history at the time at Teesdale, and he himself had gone to Christchurch, and so he encouraged me to apply there, and I was fortunate enough to be accepted. As I say, I think I was the first person ever to do that. It was quite daunting to get to Christchurch, honestly, because that was one of the more established of the universities there, very grand buildings, quite a big sense of entitlement. So that was all a bit of a shock for a 18-year-old from Teesdale. But eventually one worked out that the people that made the most noise weren't necessarily the best informed. They were just the noisiest.
So how did you feel that people viewed you as a northerner? Because I would imagine it was more unusual at that time. It's probably still relatively a minority of people who go from the north to Oxford and Cambridge now. How do you feel people viewed you at the time?
Yeah, well, it was, so Teesdale, if you start at Teesdale at the time, because of the fact that there was still the throes of the county school, which was a direct grant school through to the mid-70s. Yeah. So in my sixth form, there were 5 boys and 19 girls. Okay. I think the balance is probably a bit different now.
Yeah.
And then when I went to Christchurch to do PPE, and there were only 2 in my group doing what is now regarded as the sort of entry degree for politicians these days. But there were about 10 people at Christchurch doing PPE, of which 2 went to state schools. So there was me and a friend of mine still who came from South Wales. So it was almost as if they picked the 2 areas. If they were going to pick 2 areas, they thought they'd pick one from County Durham and one from South Wales.
Yeah, and
so it was reasonably intimidating.
Yeah, and how often do you get back to the Teesdale region? What things do you miss about the region?
Less now. My mother moved. So my father was the bank manager at NatWest in Barnard Castle.
Okay.
And he died now 26 years ago. But my mother lived in Woodside until 2 years ago, and she moved to York then. I used to be a season ticket holder at Sunderland, so we used to leave southwest London every other Saturday to go to see Sunderland when my family was a little younger. I don't do that anymore, as you might imagine. So we don't get back so much now, but it's still where my heart is, and you can't shake off your support for your football team.
No, so struggling in League One. Have you watched the Netflix Sunderland Till I Die documentary?
Actually, I haven't. I couldn't bear it. It would be like watching my own funeral. But I did give up another 2 hours of my life on Saturday night to watch the rather dull 1-1 draw with Hull City, which brought things into reasonably sharp relief.
It strikes me with some football knowledge of the history of the North East that the year that you were embarking on your sixth form studies, or it might have been the year that Alan Porterfield scored for Sunderland in the FA Cup final.
That's Ian Porterfield. But
Porterfield, yeah.
Sharing your knowledge, but that's right. So that was the first time I'd ever gone to London. I live in London now. I've lived in London for 40 years, but the first time I ever went to London was for the 1973 Cup final to when Sunderland beat Leeds.
Yeah, and Bobby Stoke going with his funny hat and incredible saves. Right. Yeah.
Little did I realise what I was going to inflict upon myself, my brother, and my children. But
or that they might not have won anything else since.
No, well, that's right. Nothing substantive. They've been they've been champions of the old First Division a couple of times, but that was the last time they won a trophy of note. Yeah. So I could make the observation that it's more recent than the Newcastle equivalent, but that would be churlish.
Well, of course, far be it from any Sunderland fan to point that out. So you find yourself in London now. What is it that you do? What is your business all about? How did that come about?
So what I now do is I run a business called Urban and Civic, which is a rather specialised property company which develops what I guess like a mini version of new towns like Peterlee or Newton Aycliffe, but not quite on that scale, and hopefully with some slightly better architecture. So in and around London, I build schools, build roads, plant trees, water flowers, and create this environment for house builders to come on and build houses, because obviously there's a very considerable shortage in and around London. So the scale of them are quite large. So anything between 3 and 10,000 houses. So some of the biggest developments in the country would be ones that we would be responsible for.
So how do you get to that from a PPE degree?
A few short steps, but I've been involved with property for a very long time now. And I was on the board, until recently, I was on the board of the London School of Economics. So there's always been I built a lot of what became the Olympics. And I still sponsor a school in the middle of the Olympics, of the Olympic Park. And so that combination of how you create places that people want to live in, but ones which function strongly from the outset, has been something that we've been interested in for a long time.
So lots of people who are listening to this will be sitting in the leafy and open surrounds of Teesdale, where we're very lucky to have lots and lots and lots of countryside, and you're sitting in the middle of London. What would you say are the major challenges for developing these spaces and developing properties in an urban area?
Yeah, mine are not so much urban. They're what I would call semi-rural. So they are typically things like old airfields. So, for example, the big Cold War airfield in Cambridgeshire is now being turned into a new community. So the challenge, and so we're fortunate actually to be able to build in access to green spaces from the start. It's not like London, where on that first lockdown they closed all the parks and locked the gates, which goes to your point about greater access. I've built quite a lot of schools. We're building 4 schools at the moment. We've got about another 20 in the pipeline. And one of the things that we are very insistent on, which some of your listeners might be struggling about, is broadband access. They have great broadband access because we're able to lay that ourselves from the outset, whereas I know in Teesdale that's a bit of a struggle sometimes. So they're not really in London. They're basically outside the M25, but within 100 miles of London.
Yeah.
So in places like Cambridge, where there is a very strong growing population. And the big challenges for us are getting things going in the first place and making sure the roads work properly. Put a lot of changed roundabouts in my life. All of those aspects are ones which the technical parts before you start can take anything up to 5 years. So that and the business has just been bought recently by Wellcome Trust, which is a kind of happy circularity for me, because of course the money from Wellcome Trust came from the sale to Glaxo. So in I think about 1995, somewhere like that. So the Glaxo, of course, is adjoins Teesdale School.
Yeah.
And at that time created the biggest pharmaceutical company in the world, and that so it's called Glaxo Wellcome. And the money that came by Glaxo buying Wellcome has been invested, and they recently bought the business that I set up in order to be able to continue on what I hope is the case of realizing value by doing good. I mean, I'm very proud of the schools and the communities that we're creating. It's very satisfying when you build a new primary school, and one recently in Cambridgeshire, where you see the children running there for the first time. You get a real kick out of that when you've built it yourself.
Absolutely.
So that's a very strong element for me.
And what would you say, if any, is the influence of the geography and the environment in which you grew up in how you envision the communities that you are helping to build and the developments that you are working on?
I'm not so sure if it's the environment, honestly, as the attitude and approach. I mean, it's hard to be arrogant coming from Teesdale, and so you approach things hopefully with a sense of what is important and what's right. Ben Bagley gave a great speech which I happened to read when he was the first headmaster in 1959, and he said that it was important to try for the pupils to go on and earn what he described as a comfortable living, but also to know what was the value of a good life and what you could contribute. Yeah. And I think that it really is the case that if you come from County Durham, and in my case have lived in southwest London for 40 years, but County Durham's still what I call home, and that does. So I'm not sure it's so much the environment as the attitudes that you start with, and that's certainly governed the way that I've tried to do things, both in the business and in those other responsibilities that I've taken on over the years.
Yeah, it's interesting when you said about the speech by the headmaster. I remember an ex-student of mine during a careers session, and I said, "What sort of job would you like to do?" And she said, "Well, I'm not sure, but I'd like to have enough money to be able to do my food shop at Sainsbury's, and then every now and again to go to Marks and Spencer Simply Food for some treats." So, as a definition of what a good life was, that's what she had in her head. Obviously, we find ourselves in the middle of the second big national lockdown, and we've got lots of students working at home, and we've got parents trying to help them. What advice, what words of wisdom could you offer as someone who's used to developing lots and lots of big projects on how to manage their time at the moment and how to navigate their way through the next few months?
Look, it's really hard, and it's very easy to come over and sound patronising. And I know how tough it is because I chair the Royal Shakespeare Company and have done that for almost 10 years. And we have a whole series of partnership schools and a programme of how learning Shakespeare helps in a broader curriculum, and the point that you access to broadband and the fact that it breaks down and all of those frustrations. So it is clearly difficult at the moment, but I think that we will get through it. I think for one of the things that I've always tried to, and I've got 4 children, I tell them that you never get a second chance to make a first impression. It's really important that you continue on that, and recognise, because it's tough at the moment, you've got to recognise that you've got to keep going because of the fact that it's the little things that do make a difference. And when you listen with curiosity, with the intent to understand, not just to reply. People respond. The business that I've been doing is very much, although it's huge amounts of money and massive assets and all those things, it fundamentally goes back to people. And there are all these studies that show that sadly people make judgments about other people within a minute of having met them in the first place. So that sense of, as I say, not wasting that first opportunity is really important. You can never get them back.
Yeah.
And so I would encourage people your pupils, that you have to keep going in these tough times. I know it seems like, and it's very difficult for young people at the moment. I think compared with when I could see that from my own children, from when we started, that first step is really tough. There's no doubt about that, and there's no getting away from it. And honestly, it's tougher if you're in Teesdale than if you live in London, because of the fact that how you access a whole number of opportunities and all of those things. So I'm extremely conscious of that. And that importance of making those first impressions, taking advantage of that is what you have to do. I would say, and I really do think, that once, and again I see it from my own children, once you are established, then actually I think the opportunities are greater, genuinely greater than 35 and 40 years ago. But getting started is definitely hard.
And finally, on a lighter note, we're stuck in the middle of this time where lots of people are at home. If you could recommend a good book for people to read, students or their parents, an interesting film or documentary to watch, or an interesting album or song to listen to, what would you pick as your recommendation?
Well, in terms of albums, I'd have to say Born to Run by Bruce Springsteen. So Bruce Springsteen, that's got so many different elements for me, because I met my wife at Teesdale. She was a fifth former, Christine Wilson. She was a fifth former when I was in the upper sixth. And 45 years later, we've been married for 30 years. And so there's a track on there called She's the One. Everybody knows about Born to Run. Well, probably everybody of my age knows about Born to Run, and the famous quote about combing your hair in the girls combing their hair in the rear view mirror while the boys try to look so hard, which was very much the way that we were at the time. But there's also one called She's the One, and so that would be the track for me, where it describes when you look at somebody for the first time. So for me, that would be an old romantic. And I remember very well wheeling my 5-year-old brother, who's a lot younger than me, round the bedroom, because Born to Run was released in 1975. So wheeling him round the bedroom, and he went on. He was 5 years old at the time. I was 17. He was 5, and he went on to be to go to the RSC, and subsequently was Inspector Alan McKenna on Coronation Street. Okay. And then the banker on Deal or No Deal. So he was the man behind behind the telephone. And so that would probably be and he now has his own television production company with ITV. So, but those would be the strongest memories for me, probably, in terms of an album. I'm not very good on films, I'm afraid. So I of course watch a lot of plays, but I haven't been seeing many of those recently.
No.
Although I was able to cheer myself up after watching Sunderland on Saturday night by a stream that the RSC is doing at the moment, called Swinging the Dream. And this was a streaming of a production that we were supposed to be doing of Midsummer Night's Dream. And we discovered that in 1939 there was an attempt to put Midsummer Night's Dream on in the Centre Theatre in Broadway, and it had 150 cast. It was 3,500 seater theatre. Had Louis Armstrong playing bottom,
Okay.
So was intended as a surefire success, and actually it bombed after 2 weeks, and then they closed it. But the streaming that the RSC did on Saturday night was very joyous. And I mean, and maybe just finishing off, actually, again, it's slightly cheating, but one of the happiest things for me was, again, with Midsummer Night's Dream. So the Castle Players, which perhaps some of the listeners will know, which is
still going strong.
Yeah, still going strong. So they were established, actually. My father, who was the bank manager in Barnard Castle, lent them the money for their first ever performance, which was of Midsummer Night's Dream, 1988. And as you would know, they play in the grounds of the Boat Museum. But in 2016, as part of a national tour that we did for the Midsummer Night's Dream, the Castle Players played the parts of the Rude Mechanicals in Midsummer Night's Dream. And one of my happiest nights ever was that everybody eventually came to Stratford, and the Castle Players did that for a couple of nights in June. And we had a great party afterwards. So it was a really, Jill Cole had done a fantastic job of organising things.
Yep.
And then they came and played at Stratford, and we had a very good party, which perhaps some of the people listening today would attended.
Yeah.
And it was a real thrill for me to see the Castle Players on the stage at Stratford. So, if we can do that, we can try and do most things.
Yeah, well, I know Jill. I've taught both of her children, and she does great work with the Castle Players, and seen many performances myself. Thank you very much for your time today, Nigel. I hugely appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners do as well.
A real pleasure. Go very well, and good luck for the school.
Thank you. There's a guy who has achieved some incredible things and done business with some very important and powerful people, but who has never lost sight of where he came from and still feels that County Durham is his home, even though he has lived in London for most of his life. So that's it for this episode of Made in Teesdale. If you know someone who you think has an interesting story that they would like to tell on this podcast, then let me know. If you yourself have an interesting story that you would like to tell, then please get in touch. Until the next episode, take care, stay safe, goodbye.